nie darüber sprachen. Es hat jeden geschauert. Jeder war sich sicher, dass es das nächste Mal wieder tun würde, wenn es zu Polen wird, wenn es notwendig ist. Ich meine, die Judenevakuierung, die Ausrottung des jüdischen Volkes.
Rudolf Hess was deputy Führer until 1941, when he flew to Scotland to attempt to broker a peace deal between Germany and Britain. Sentenced to life imprisonment at Nuremberg, Hess died in Spandau prison in Berlin in 1987, aged 93.
Vorzubeugen, dass ich für verhandlungsunfähig erklärt werde, gebe ich dem Gericht nachfolgende Erklärung ab. Die Gründe für das Vortäuschen von Gedächtnisverlust sind taktischer Art.
Hitler's architect and Minister of Armaments, Albert Speer, constructed grandiose Nazi buildings and used slave labor to keep Germany's wartime economy going. He was sentenced to 20 years imprisonment at the Nuremberg trials and died in London in 1981. The following short clip is not subtitled.
Und der Zusammenbruch seines Systems haben eine ungeheure Leidenszeit über das deutsche Volk gebracht. Die nutzlose Fortsetzung dieses Krieges und die unnötigen Zerstörungen erschweren den Wiederaufbau.
Joachim von Ribbentrop, Hitler's foreign minister, was captured by the British at the end of the war after some months in hiding in Hamburg, tried at Nuremberg and hanged in 1946. Fluent in English, he was German ambassador to Great Britain from the 1930s.
Es ist möglich geworden, durch die großzügige, weit vorausschauende Einstellung des deutschen Reichskanzlers. Es ist der erste praktische Schritt seit Jahren auf dem Wege zu einer Rüstungsbegrenzung und zu einer allgemeinen Befriedung in Europa.
Baldur von Schirach, the first Hitler Youth leader, was half American and was a descendant of two signers of the Declaration of Independence. From 1940 to 45, he was Gauleiter of Vienna. Sentenced to 20 years at Nuremberg, he died in 1974.
Alle Jugend dem Führer, das ist die Parole der HJ. Und wie in den vergangenen Jahren rufen wir auch heute den Jahrgang der 10-Jährigen.
Let's end not with a Nazi, but a fascist, Benito Mussolini, who was Hitler's ally in the war. Here he speaks English in a clip from the early 1930s.
I am very glad to be able to express my friendly feelings towards the American nation. Friendship with which Italy looks at the millions of citizens who from Alaska to Florida, from the Pacific to the Atlantic, live in the United States, is today deeply rooted in our hearts. This feeling, created by mutual interests, so contributed to the preparation of an ever brighter era in the life of both nations. I grieve the wonderful energy of the American people, and I see and recognize among you sons of your land as well as ours, my fellow citizens who are working to make America great. I salute the great American people. I salute the Italians of America, who unite in a single love, our two nations.
Thanks for watching. Please subscribe and share. Don't forget also to visit my new audiobook channel, War Stories with Mark Felton. You can also help support both of my channels at PayPal and Patreon. Details in the description box below.
We will try to behave like a civilized family.
Compiègne, France, 22nd of June 1940. Hitler met representatives of the French government and military to accept the nation's surrender. The Battle of France was over. All hostilities between Germany and France would end 3 days later on the 25th of June. Hitler insisted that the surrender ceremony be held in the same railway carriage where, in 1918, Germany had surrendered to the Allies, ending World War I. Afterwards, on Hitler's order, the Pullman car was displayed in a museum in Berlin, but it was destroyed later in the war in a British air raid. A reconstruction is now on display at Compiègne. Paris had fallen to the Germans on the 14th of June. Declared an open city, it was untouched by the fighting and was swiftly occupied, the German army parading down the Champs-Élysées past the Arc de Triomphe. Hitler, the frustrated artist and architect, wanted to visit Paris. The huge victory parade had been planned, but it was abandoned after advice from the German artist and architect occupied, the German army parading down the Champs-Élysées past the Arc de Triomphe. Hitler, the frustrated artist and architect, wanted to visit Paris. The huge victory parade had been planned, but it was abandoned after advice from the German military, who feared it would be a prime target for British bombers. Instead, Hitler decided to stage a literal flying visit to Paris. Armed with a list of tourist destinations that he wanted to see, it would be his first time in the City of Light, and he came not only as a sightseer, but as the conqueror of Western Europe. Only the British Empire still fought on against him. At the time of the French capitulation, Hitler was at his forward headquarters in France, codenamed Wolfsschlucht, or Wolf's Gorge, where he had been directing the battle since the 6th of June 1940. 2 days after accepting the French surrender, Hitler made his trip to Paris. It was an almost furtive affair rather than a triumphal entry. Hitler's party flew in 2 special Focke-Wulf FW-200 Condors to Le Bourget Airport in Paris, touching down at 5:30 in the morning. For the trip, Hitler had asked his personal architect Albert Speer to accompany him, along with the sculptor Arno Breker and architect Hermann Giesler. The rest of his entourage consisted of his usual aides and staff, including his pilot, Hans Bauer, secretary, Martin Bormann, adjutant, Schaub, and General Wilhelm Keitel of the High Command. Hitler's party also included his personal protection officers from the Reichssicherheitsdienst, or RSD, and a small detachment of Führer-Begleitkommando bodyguards, or FBK. Hitler being routinely guarded by several different SS and army agencies with sometimes overlapping responsibilities. The 3 civilians, Speer, Breker, and Giesler, were kitted out in field grey officers' uniforms so as not to stand out in the party. Preparations in Paris for the Führer's visit were minimal. Streets were not cordoned off or guarded. Hitler's party, in 5 large Mercedes field cars, drove straight into the city through largely deserted streets. The cars were all open-topped, and Hitler sat in the front passenger seat of one of the cars, with Speer and Breker on jump seats behind, and Giesler and some adjutants in the rear. First stop on the tour was Hitler's favorite, the Paris Opera House. He knew the building from studying its blueprints, but was awestruck by its beauty. Met on the steps by Colonel Hans Speidel of the occupation forces, who ironically in later years was a member of the anti-Hitler resistance amongst army circles. A French caretaker accompanied the group through the deserted building, unlocking doors. Hitler's evident knowledge of the building impressed his entourage. As Albert Speer wrote in his book in 1970, near the proscenium box, Hitler found a salon missing, remarked on it, and turned out to be right. The French attendant said that this room had been eliminated in the course of renovations many years ago. There, you see how well I know my way about, Hitler commented complacently. He seemed fascinated by the opera, went into ecstasies about its beauty, his eyes glittering with an excitement that struck me as uncanny. The attendant, of course, had immediately recognized the person he was guiding through the building. In a businesslike but distinctly aloof manner, he showed us through the rooms. When we were at last ready to leave the building, Hitler whispered something to his adjutant, who took a 50-mark note from his wallet and went over to the attendant standing some distance away. Pleasantly but firmly, the man refused to take the money. Hitler tried a second time, sending Breker over to him, and the man persisted in his refusal. He had only been doing his duty, he told Breker. After leaving the opera, Hitler's convoy drove to La Madeleine, where Hitler got out and viewed the church. The convoy now moved on to the Trocadero. Hitler got out to view the Eiffel Tower from a distance. He couldn't climb the tower because the French authorities had severed the lift cables shortly before the Germans had taken over Paris, and the Eiffel Tower remained out of commission until 1946. After many photos, the party drove on to pass the Arc de Triomphe with the tomb of the unknown warrior beneath the archway, and stopped again at Les Invalides, home of Emperor Napoleon I's tomb. Hitler admired Napoleon, and there was much symbolism in his visit to this place. Hitler stood for a long time gazing down at Napoleon's burial place. Next stop was the Pantheon, and Hitler was greatly impressed by its proportions. The last stop on the tour was Montmartre and the giant white cathedral atop the hill, the Sacré-Cœur. People going to church recognized Hitler, but ignored him. By 9 a.m., Hitler's party was back at the airport preparing to depart. Hitler was ecstatic. He turned to Speer and said, "It was the dream of my life to be permitted to see Paris. I cannot say how happy I am to have had that dream fulfilled today." Then he was gone, never to return. In the greatest of ironies, in 1944, as Allied forces approached Paris, Hitler ordered the city destroyed. Fortunately for history, the German general commanding the city couldn't bring himself to do it, and Paris survived the war largely untouched. Thanks for watching. Please subscribe and share. Also help support my channel at PayPal and Patreon. Details in the description box.
You're not a child, you're a man. So stop wearing so many layers to go outside. And get the Bearskin Tactical Hoodie 4.0, the 10-pocket tactical micro-fleece hoodie that blocks wind, repels rain, and regulates heat for incredible comfort, wherever you are. Because the average hoodie made these days is weak, flimsy, and has one weird kangaroo pocket in the front. And listen, you're not a kangaroo, you're a man.
By early 1945, with the failure of the Ardennes offensive in the west and the massive Soviet offensive in the east, time was clearly running out for Nazi Germany, a fact that was becoming obvious to many of her leaders. Hitler remained convinced that the war could still end favorably for Germany, but he was becoming an increasingly isolated and physically degenerated figure who believed his own propaganda. It was true that the German army and the Waffen-SS were performing miracles in attempting to hold the western and eastern fronts, not to mention Italy as well. But with the German economy collapsing under the weight of heavy Allied bombing, and with too few well-trained soldiers and sufficient armored vehicles, and most importantly fuel, the attrition was unsustainable. Heinrich Himmler, head of the SS and the police, was by 1945 unquestionably the second most powerful man in Germany after Hitler. The SS he had built up was all-powerful, controlling a 900,000-strong army, the Waffen-SS, and a huge system of concentration and labor camps and many industrial enterprises, making the SS a state within a state. Himmler had benefited greatly in the aftermath of the July 1944 bomb plot against Hitler, allowing him to extend his influence over the regular army, whose generals were now held in suspicion by the Führer, and Himmler used the roundups that followed the bomb to remove many of his remaining opponents. But Himmler had been stupidly promoted to field command by Hitler, leading first to his incompetent handling of the situation in the Vosges Mountains against US and French troops in the winter of 1944-45, and then command of Army Group Vistula to hold the Soviet offensive into Pomerania in early 1945. Himmler was eventually relieved of his command on the 20th of March. These failures drove a wedge between Himmler and Hitler, so much so that Himmler decided to take action to end the war without recourse to Hitler. His intention was to negotiate a peace settlement with the Western powers, that is the United States, Great Britain and France, allowing Germany to concentrate all her forces on stopping the Soviets, and in the process making Himmler the leader of Germany. Himmler had access to Germany's best secret intelligence organizations and information, but he chose as his peace envoy his beloved and trusted masseur, Felix Kersten, a Baltic German physical therapist, whom Himmler had come to rely upon to cure his stomach cramps caused by stress and anxiety. A society figure with a list of influential European patients, Kersten had already acted as Himmler's special envoy before. In August 1942, Kersten had helped organize Himmler's visit to Finland and was completely trusted. Himmler began peace negotiations, knowing full well that he couldn't inform Hitler of what he was doing. Hitler was firmly welded to fighting to the bitter end, and some historians have suggested that Himmler may have been seeking to eventually supplant Hitler as leader, as the Führer continued to deteriorate physically. And if any man could have toppled Hitler from within the inner circle, Himmler was probably best placed with the men and resources at his disposal. Himmler's first step was in reaching out to the Allies via neutral Sweden. Kersten was already in Stockholm and approached Count Volker Bernadotte, an aristocrat and a head of the Swedish Red Cross. Bernadotte had organized prisoner exchanges in 1943 and 44, whereby 11,000 Allied POWs were brought out of Germany via Sweden. He had a good working relationship with both sides. Himmler entered into a correspondence with Bernadotte, and Himmler sent his spy master, SS Brigadeführer Walter Schellenberg, to Stockholm for face-to-face meetings. Himmler realized that he had some leverage with the Nordic nations, and could possibly earn some goodwill from the Western Allies by using some of the concentration camp prisoners as pawns in this game. By now, Himmler was indeed playing a dangerous game. On the 20th of April 1945, he duly turned up at Hitler's last birthday celebration at the Reich Chancellery in Berlin, a heavily bombed mess by this stage. The same day, Soviet spearheads reached the city's eastern suburbs and opened fire with artillery. To Hitler's face, Himmler swore complete allegiance before leaving Berlin as soon as he could, going north for a meeting the following day at Kersten's country estate at Harzwalde, 70 kilometers north of the capital. The previous day, Norbert Mazur, Swedish representative of the World Jewish Congress, had been flown from Stockholm to Tempelhof Airport in Berlin. The trip arranged by Kersten. Mazur was then driven to Harzwalde to await the arrival of Himmler and Schellenberg. Himmler arrived at the estate at 2:30 a.m. on the 21st of April and had a rather bizarre 2.5-hour meeting with Mazur, an extraordinary meeting between two dread enemies. Himmler tried to justify the Holocaust to Mazur and even told him, "I want to bury the hatchet between us and the Jews. If I had had my own way, many things would have been done differently." Himmler also told Mazur, who would inform Bernadotte and the Allies, waiting and watching behind him, that he was the Nazi leader the Western Allies should be talking to. He even wanted the Allies to set aside the final solution and move on. To us today, Himmler appears completely deluded, but his utterances demonstrate both his ruthlessness and lack of empathy for the victims of his policies, and his self-belief that he was the only man capable of saving Germany at this stage in the war. As an act of what Himmler perceived as goodwill, he ordered the release of 20,000 concentration camp inmates, many of them Scandinavians, and permitted their safe transport on the so-called white buses to Sweden. On the 23rd of April, Himmler had his first face-to-face meeting with Count Bernadotte when he went to the Swedish consulate in Lübeck in northern Germany. This meeting was critical. Himmler believed that he had established his good faith by permitting the White Buses operation to go ahead, and now he told Bernadotte that Hitler, in a burning Berlin being encircled by powerful Soviet armies, would probably be dead in 2 to 3 days. Himmler stated that he was basically the leader in waiting. Officially, according to the 1941 Law of Succession, drawn up following Rudolf Hesse's flight to Britain, Hitler's successor was Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring, the corpulent, drug-addled, and by now sidelined and disgraced head of the Air Force. It appeared unlikely that someone with Himmler's power would have agreed to serve under Göring as Führer. Therefore, Himmler asked Bernadotte to contact the Allied Supreme Commander, General Dwight D. Eisenhower, and tell him that Germany was prepared, under Himmler's leadership and with Himmler's SS and police keeping order, to surrender to the Western Allies, but only the Western Allies. There could be no surrender to the Soviet Union. Bernadotte suggested that Himmler write a letter to Eisenhower setting out these proposals. Of course, Himmler was now committing his treason to paper. The problem was the Allies had agreed among themselves that no one nation could accept a German surrender or partial surrender. Germany had to surrender unconditionally to all of the Allies. So if Roosevelt and Churchill had accepted Himmler's proposal, which they never did, and accepted a ceasefire and surrender of Germany's Western armies, it would have led to an immediate crisis with Stalin, and perhaps even war between the Allies. Himmler knew from long experience that the Western Allies didn't trust Stalin and were concerned by how much Europe he would swallow up before Germany's final capitulation, but Roosevelt and Churchill remained firm on the point of unconditional German surrender. Himmler was also deluding himself if he thought that the Western Allies wanted to deal with him or allow him to become the de facto leader of Germany. The Holocaust and German occupation policies throughout Europe, much of it stemming from Himmler's SS and Gestapo, ensured that Himmler was labeled as a major criminal to be found and punished once Germany surrendered. But things were happening beyond Himmler's control. The same day that Himmler met Bernadotte in Lübeck, Hermann Göring precipitated a leadership crisis in Berlin. Göring had also left Berlin on the 20th of April, following Hitler's birthday and a military conference in the Führerbunker. He had made arrangements to have trainloads of art and antiques, much of it looted from private collections, shipped south from his huge estate, Karrenhall, near Berlin, to the relative safety of Obersalzberg, near Berchtesgaden in southern Bavaria, where Göring also maintained a house next to Hitler's.
All right, Orange Theory, looking awesome. Keep it up. Time to get into that orange zone. Push pace. Orange Theory, we go all out together. Shut it down.
SketchUp for iPad is the most complete and versatile mobile architectural modeling software ever made. As a designer waiting with
Berghof. In Berlin, Hitler suffered a breakdown during a military situation conference in the bunker, and after calming down, announced that the war was lost. Luftwaffe officers at the meeting reported to Göring that Hitler had broke the situation in the house next to Hitler's Berghof. In Berlin, Hitler suffered a breakdown during a military situation conference in the bunker, and after calming down, announced that the war was lost. Luftwaffe officers at the meeting reported to Göring that Hitler had broken and reneged all responsibility towards army and state. Göring was encouraged to send a telegram to Hitler asking him for permission to assume the leadership of the Reich. But Hitler recovered from his momentary lapse, and his sinister private secretary and minister without portfolio, Martin Bormann, intercepted the cable and spun it to Hitler as an attempt by Göring to seize power, in effect a coup. Hitler ordered Göring's arrest and stripped him of all his positions, removing him from the line of succession. However, though Göring's disgrace had cleared him out of the way of Himmler's succession, who would probably have been Hitler's natural choice under the circumstances, Himmler's overtures to Eisenhower were rebuffed. On the 26th of April, General Schellenberg was informed by Count Löwenhaupt, the Swedish legation at Lübeck, that Himmler's offer to surrender troops in Western Europe to the Allies had not been well received, specifically because Himmler was unacceptable to the Western powers as a person with whom discussions could be undertaken. Schellenberg did not inform Himmler of this development. Himmler had already dispatched a US Army Air Force general the Germans had captured earlier in the war, named Vanneman, on the 24th of April to Switzerland, bearing a formal offer of German capitulation from Himmler to Eisenhower. On the 27th of April, Himmler breakfasted with Schellenberg and Count Bernadotte at Apenrode, and he expressed again his desire for some limited accord with the Allies, where he could still play a part. But Himmler's secret scheme was now leaked to the press, and the Western powers very publicly dismissed Himmler's peace offer, effectively ending his ambition to hang on to some high office after Hitler's demise. That same day, Himmler's SS liaison at the bunker, Gruppenführer Hermann Fegelein, went absent without leave, and was discovered naked, drunk, and in the company of his mistress in his Berlin apartment, with a suitcase full of civilian clothes packed. Hitler's bodyguards bundled him back to the bunker, where Bormann pressured Hitler to have him shot. The proverbial hit the fan on the evening of the 28th of April, when BBC Radio broadcast a Reuters press report all about Himmler's secret peace negotiations, this being picked up in the bunker by a gleeful Bormann. When Hitler was presented with evidence of the Reichsführer's disloyalty, he went berserk. Himmler was declared a traitor, relieved of all his officers and ordered arrested. The hapless Fegelein was marched outside and shot. When Hitler gave these orders, Soviet troops were only 300 yards from the bunker. The following day, Hitler confirmed Göring and Himmler's expulsion from the Nazi Party and dismissal from all offices, and named his successor as Grand Admiral Karl Dönitz, then headquartered at Flensburg in the north of Germany. Himmler, however, was not arrested, despite Hitler's order. He moved with Schellenberg, his adjutants, personal staff and bodyguard battalion to Kalkhorst, establishing a new SS headquarters there. Here he contemplated his next moves. Hitler killed himself on the 30th of April, and Dönitz succeeded as planned. Some of Himmler's subordinates pressed him to use his remaining men and take over Dönitz's new government. But Himmler was unsure and hesitant. He decided to use Schellenberg to continue negotiations with the Allies via Sweden and also through Grand Admiral Dönitz. Himmler wanted to be appointed a minister in the new government, and he did have some influence over Dönitz. It was Himmler who convinced Dönitz to replace Joachim von Ribbentrop as Nazi foreign minister. Von Ribbentrop, his career at an end and fearing capture, scuttled off to Hamburg and went into hiding. He was eventually apprehended by a British Army snatch squad some weeks after the city had been captured, shacked up in a grimy flat with a half-naked young woman. Himmler remained an important figure at Dönitz's new headquarters. The impression given of Himmler as a meek, confused and cowardly individual begging Dönitz for a new role and then being rebuffed is inaccurate. In fact, Dönitz actually appointed Himmler commander of all remaining German armed forces in northern Germany, Denmark and Norway. When Dönitz received Bormann's message from the Führer bunker ordering him to arrest Himmler as a traitor, Dönitz had actually been in a meeting with the Reichsführer discussing the imminent fall of Hamburg to the British. Instead of arresting him, Dönitz continued with the meeting. The following day, Himmler went to Dönitz's headquarters and had lunch with the Grand Admiral. According to his mistress, Hedwig Potthast, Himmler hired rooms in Lübeck for her, and Himmler came to stay with her. This is in despite of the accepted history that Himmler was preparing to move south. But at some point, the pretense that Himmler would be able to obtain a position in Dönitz's government became clear. On the 6th of May 1945, only hours before the end of the war in Europe, Dönitz informed Himmler that according to Hitler's last will and testament, the copy having now reached him, Himmler was dismissed from all offices of state forthwith. He was no longer Reichsführer SS, head of the German police, or commander-in-chief of the reserve army. He was finished. Himmler apparently was castigated by the new Nazi Minister of the Interior, Count Schwerin von Krosigk, when he told him bluntly, You should drive straight to Montgomery's headquarters and say you are Heinrich Himmler and that you want to take full responsibility for everything the SS has done. At this point, having exhausted all possible avenues as a peacemaker and latterly as a prospective minister in the new government, Himmler was left with two viable options: surrender himself to the Allies and face trial as a major war criminal and, of course, inevitable execution, or go into hiding. He chose the latter course. When Count von Krosigk told Himmler to drive to Montgomery's headquarters and take responsibility for the crimes of his SS, Himmler apparently turned white, said nothing in reply, and left Dönitz's headquarters, never to return. He evidently realized on the 6th of May 1945 that his power was at an end. But he didn't flee into hiding, at least not yet. Though the SS state functioned right up to the end of the war, Himmler didn't have his personal plane standing by to fly him to Sweden, Spain, Antarctica, or the moon. Rather, he moved to a requisitioned farmhouse at Zadrup. At this point, Himmler released his guard unit, which made itself scarce, and was left with a handful of trusted officers and men from his personal staff who were all in the same position as their leader. With Himmler at Zadrup were 5 principal SS officers: his personal administrative officer, Standartenführer Dr. Rudolf Brandt, his personal doctor, Gruppenführer Dr. Karl Gebhardt, SS Brigadeführer Otto Ohlendorf, a major war criminal, his personal aide, Sturmbannführer Josef Kiermeier, and his 2 adjutants, Obersturmbannführer Werner Grothmann and Sturmbannführer Heinz Macher. There were also present about 10 other SS men, 7 of whom were NCOs. This group of perhaps 16 men, including Himmler, still had 4 large field cars at its disposal and plenty of weapons. According to established histories, Himmler now determined to go to Bavaria. According to Count von Krosigk, Himmler had previously stated to him sometime in early May the following regarding the Allies: "They will never discover me. Political developments are going to be in my favor. I shall go into hiding to await them." We will deal with Himmler's movements on the run in a future video, but it certainly appears the case that Himmler still sought some future role in Germany, and his stated aim was to lie low and then re-emerge once the political situation was favorable. He didn't appear to be interested in escaping from Germany. He was close to neutral Sweden, yet gathered his loyalists to go south through the entire length of Germany under Allied military control to Bavaria, when he could still have fled with relative ease north to a neutral nation. Himmler the peacemaker was now Himmler the fugitive, but Himmler remained in the game and a wily and resourceful opponent at this stage. The Reichsführer SS was in a tricky situation. He had exhausted avenues with both the Allies, who wanted nothing to do with him, and Grand Admiral Karl Dönitz's new Nazi government in northern Germany, who eventually dismissed him from his offices of state on the 6th of May 1945, following Hitler's earlier instructions. Himmler had drastically reduced his entourage from several hundred officers and men to only 14 faithful officers and NCOs. Since the 6th of May, Himmler and this group were staying at a farmhouse in Zadrup, and Himmler announced his intention to go south to Bavaria. The obvious question is, why? In the previous video, we saw that Himmler had plenty of opportunities to flee to neutral Sweden, but did not go. To travel south throughout Germany was extremely risky. Though the country was in an uproar with millions of displaced civilians and demobilized German soldiers wandering about, British and US troops were starting to exercise control over their territories, and Allied patrols and checkpoints were everywhere. One of their purposes was the identification and apprehension of persons of interest to the new occupiers, and Himmler was at the top of that long list. Whilst at Zadrup, Himmler and his remaining followers changed their appearances. Primarily, this meant removing all insignia from their uniforms and obtaining false documentation. All of them, including Himmler, would pretend to be recently demobilized German secret field police, Geheime Volkspolizei. Himmler himself carrying papers that identified him as Sergeant Heinrich Hitzinger, lately of a special armored company attached to the secret field police, demobilized on the 3rd of May 1945. The collective story was that the group were ill and making their way back home, just another 15 German soldiers among millions roving the highways and byways of recently surrendered Germany. Himmler also altered his physical appearance, as he was the most recognizable among the group due to the many hours of wartime newsreel appearances, thousands of photographs and public speeches. He shaved off his moustache and wore a black eye patch over his left eye. The choice of a secret field police unit was, on the surface, actually quite a good one. Such units were often staffed by middle-aged soldiers, many unfit due to war wounds or illnesses. Himmler was 44 years old at the time, and several others in the group were also middle-aged. Any Allied troops should have dismissed such a shambolic group as unimportant after a cursory glance at their papers. But the group had made a mistake. They didn't know that members of the secret field police were subject to immediate arrest by the Allies, including NCOs. This was because the secret field police was part of the Sicherheitsdienst, the SD, the SS security police. Himmler's cover name, Heinrich Hitzinger, was not made up. Hitzinger was a real person, a rural policeman tried and sentenced to death for defeatism some months before. His papers had been in the possession of the Gestapo and appropriated for Himmler's use, as Hitzinger apparently bore a strong resemblance to the Reichsfuhrer. All this suggests that Himmler had been making preparations for just such an eventuality for some weeks or months. Himmler made his move south on the 10th of May 1945, 2 days after the German surrender. The 15 men, undoubtedly well armed with pistols and machine guns, used 4 large Wanderer W11 field cars, much favoured by Himmler from his earlier visits to the front. The next day, the group arrived in the small village of Delver, a few miles southeast of Friedrichstadt on the Eider River. The next day, the convoy arrived at Marna. It had taken, due to the confusion on the roads caused by refugees, German troops and destroyed vehicles, 2 days to travel a mere 60 miles south. They were now stuck on the north bank of the Elbe River estuary, with no way to move the cars over. Instead, the 4 big field cars were abandoned, and the group walked down to the riverbank at Brunsbüttel. After some searching and negotiations, Himmler's party paid a fisherman 500 Reichsmarks to ferry them across the river to the town of Neuhaus, the mouth of the Oster River. From now on, Himmler's party would be on foot. Whatever plan the Reichsfuhrer or any other member of the party had is not known, but they continued south. For another 5 days, Himmler's party trudged along country lanes, sleeping in farms, barns, or even beside the road, becoming increasingly dirty and disheveled, footsore and exhausted. By the 18th of May, the group reached Bremerwörde, a small town on the River Oster. The plan was to walk through the open countryside to avoid getting tangled up in the towns and villages between Hamburg and Bremerhaven, which were both under full British occupation. On the 18th of May, the group moved into a farmhouse on Waldstrasse in Bremerwörde, the owners having no idea at the time of the identification of the men. SS Sturmbannführer Kiermaier, Himmler's personal aide, went forward to investigate the Oster River Bridge, which was guarded by British troops. For 2 days, Kiermaier tried to obtain special movement passes from the local mayor, the Landrat, who had been appointed to a new...
With the McDonald's app, you can get your favorite thing delivered to your door, so you can eat your favorite thing while you watch your favorite thing at home. Order McDelivery in the McDonald's app.
At participating McDonald's, delivery prices may be higher than at restaurants. Delivery and other fees may apply.
Administration under British authority. He wanted chits of paper allowing the group to pass through the checkpoint for some manufactured reason, such as a group of sick German troops returning home to Munich. But the Landrat, probably realizing that Kiermaier represented some group of Nazi fugitives, and probably not keen on antagonizing his new masters, refused all entreaties. Himmler's group hung around at the farmhouse from the 18th to the 21st of May, before a decision was taken to try and get past the checkpoint and continue their journey. Himmler and his 2 adjutants, Grothmann and Macher, would hold back while the rest of the group attempted to cross the bridge. At 3 p.m., Kiermaier and Himmler's personal doctor, Gebhardt went to the bridge, apparently not realizing that there was an unguarded ford some distance down the river where everyone could have crossed without any problems. Kiermaier and Gebhardt intended to cross the bridge, and if there were no problems, come back and fetch the others. At 4 p.m., the two Germans were stopped on the bridge by Sergeant Ken Baysbrown of 1003 Field Security Reserve Detachment, the British Army's Intelligence Corps. He examined the men's demobilization passes and knew immediately that, as secret field police, they must be arrested. But keeping this to himself, Baysbrown quickly learned from Dr. Gebhardt that he was but the vanguard of a much larger group of sick ex-secret field police. Baysbrown quickly organized 2 army trucks and an escort to bring in the rest of Gebhardt's comrades. Baysbrown, using Lose's mill on the river as an office, informed his commander, Staff Sergeant John Hogg, that a party of secret field police was shortly to arrive. The trucks duly returned with Gebhardt and the rest of the group, but minus 3 men, these being Himmler and his adjutants. Another NCO, Sergeant Arthur Britton, who was actually Dutch-born, examined the Germans' documents. They all bore secret field police stamps dated the 1st or 3rd of May 1945, with smudged SD stamps. Some of the Germans now denied being members of the group. The youngest German was taken into the mill and interrogated by Britton and Baysbrown. He quickly confessed that the secret field police stamp was from SD headquarters, and they all belonged in one group. At 6 p.m., everyone was arrested, and trucks drove them to the civilian internment camp at Westertimke near Zeven. However, Sergeant Hogg retained Dr. Gebhardt, and together they drove to the farm to collect the 3 remaining men. But on arrival, Himmler and his cohorts had made themselves scarce. British intelligence was alerted to 3 secret field police suspects on the run in the area. Himmler's little group assumed that Kiermaier and Gebhardt's group had successfully crossed the bridge checkpoint. They waited and then tried themselves on the 22nd of May. The trio walked through the streets of Bremerwerder. Grothmann and Macker wore long SS officers' raincoats minus insignia and walked either side of the much shorter Himmler, who wore bits of German army uniform, a blue raincoat and an eye patch. Before they reached the bridge, a British patrol stopped them and escorted them to the mill for questioning. Sergeant Britton received them and reported their arrival by phone to Staff Sergeant Hogg. Heinrich Himmler was now in Allied hands, but for the time being, his real identity was not known to them. He was just another low-ranking German soldier to be processed into a holding camp because of his unit's World War II role. Himmler spent his first night in British captivity with Grothmann and Macker, sleeping on the floor of the mill, using grain sacks as mattresses. The important point was that if Himmler's false identity continued to hold up, he could expect to be
Pon un recordatorio mañana para ir a Walgreens por colágeno antes del trabajo a que sea un recordatorio a las 10.
Von Krosigk in early May 1945, in which he said that the Allies would never find him, so he would lie low and await political developments. When questioned, Himmler and his companions all claimed to be sergeants in the secret field police, but the smudged SD stamps on their papers were suspicious. When the British examined Himmler's baggage, they confiscated a large magnifying glass embossed with Nazi eagle wings, but apparently thought little of it. The rest of Himmler's personal items, some of them inscribed with his monogram, HH, or even his title, RFSS, had been hidden at the farm and would be found much later by Intelligence Corps NCOs. At 7 a.m. on the 23rd of May, Himmler and his companions were driven to Westertimke camp via Zeven, headquarters, the 45th Field Security Station of the British Army, arriving around 9 a.m. After processing, Himmler and his adjutants were next driven 45 miles southeast to Kolkhagen, a special interrogation camp near the village of Barnstedt, arriving after several stops around 6:30 p.m. Himmler was immediately recognized by some of the prisoners standing by the wire watching new arrivals, despite his shaved-off moustache and black eye patch, particularly by prisoner Karl Kaufmann, the former Gauleiter of Hamburg, who had met Himmler on multiple occasions. Kaufmann said that Himmler didn't recognize him, or at least pretended not to do so, and shortly afterwards removed his eye patch. Before long, most of the prisoners knew that Himmler was in residence. It appears that Himmler now knew that the game was up. Sooner or later, the British would be informed by a prisoner regarding his identity. But Himmler still had some aces up his sleeve. He was, after all, the most senior Nazi in Allied captivity and privy to a vast amount of secret information that he might use in his favor, including information embarrassing to the British. Perhaps, thought Himmler, he might yet be able to make a deal of some kind. In any case, he could expect months or even years of questioning by Allied intelligence and war crimes investigators before he would ever be brought to trial. And what he knew of hidden treasures, secret bank accounts, even more secret deals, and of Soviet intelligence operations, plus the vast SS spy networks which still existed, was surely of immense value to his captors, who were at that moment combing Germany for men useful to them in the new Cold War that was in its opening stages. With self-preservation in mind, Himmler now demanded to see the camp commandant, Captain Thomas Sylvester, and after some argument with British NCOs, he was duly granted an interview at 7 p.m. Himmler led the trio into Sylvester's office. The British officer described Himmler as small, ill-looking and shabbily dressed. His companions looked different, evidently military men, by their tall, erect bearing and severe haircuts. Sylvester ordered Grossmann and Macker removed from his office and kept under close guard. Himmler now put on a pair of glasses. Sylvester asked him his name, to which the prisoner replied quietly, Herr Heinrich Himmler. Sylvester immediately phoned British 2nd Army headquarters at Lüneburg, speaking to Major Rice, an intelligence officer who initially didn't believe him. However, after a slightly muddled conversation, Major Rice announced that he was starting out for Copenhagen immediately. While Sylvester waited for help, he ordered Himmler to strip, and NCOs carefully examined his clothing. A brass capsule container was found containing a glass ampule, evidently a cyanide capsule. Sylvester asked Himmler what it was. He replied, "That is my medicine. It cures stomach cramp." A second brass container was found. This one was empty. Sylvester ordered a full body search, but did not search Himmler's mouth, fearful that Himmler had the glass ampule of cyanide in his mouth ready to kill himself with. Here things become a bit bizarre. Himmler dressed and Sylvester ordered tea and thick British Army sandwiches, and Himmler tucked into both. If, as was later claimed, Himmler had concealed a glass ampule of cyanide in his mouth, measuring 35 by 9 millimeters, how could he have eaten thick sandwiches and drunken tea? Clearly, nothing was in his mouth at the time, and the missing ampule was not on him. How could he have been to both, kill himself with? Here things become a bit bizarre. Himmler dressed and Sylvester ordered tea and thick British Army sandwiches, and Himmler tucked into both. If, as was later claimed, Himmler had concealed a glass ampule of cyanide in his mouth, measuring 35 by 9 millimeters, how could he have eaten thick sandwiches and drunken tea? Clearly, nothing was in his mouth at the time, and the missing ampule was not on his person or in his clothing, which had been thoroughly searched. Either that, or the afternoon tea scenario was invented by Sylvester for some reason. It appears, though Sylvester later denied it, that Himmler was allowed to shave and freshen up due to the growth of stubble reported on his corpse a short time later, expressly against regulations concerning war crime suspects. Major Rice and his team of intelligence officers arrived at Copenhagen about 7:30 p.m. Rice carried with him a photograph of Himmler in his black Allgemeine SS uniform, plus a short biography that included both his date of birth, his Nazi and SS membership numbers, and a copy of his signature. However, Rice didn't have any details of Himmler's weight, height, or any other personal information like this, or a set of fingerprints. Rice's task was simple: establish Himmler's identity beyond a reasonable doubt. Himmler gave a vague answer when asked for his NSDAP membership number, and an equally imprecise though reasonably accurate SS number. He gave his correct date of birth. Asked to provide a signature, Himmler agreed on the strange condition that it be destroyed immediately afterwards. The signature matched the specimen Rice had brought with him, and Himmler was formally identified as the Reichsführer SS. Himmler was very chatty and mentioned a letter he had written to Field Marshal Sir Bernard Montgomery on the 8th of May, and even told Rice that his intention had been to lie low for a few weeks until things in Germany had calmed down, and as he said, circumstances were more favorable for an interview. He told Rice that the Soviet Union was the greater enemy, predicting war between the Allies very soon. Overall, Himmler tried to cultivate a cooperative demeanor with his captors, the exact opposite, in fact, of a man preparing to commit suicide. Rice telephoned Lüneburg and spoke with his boss, Colonel Michael Murphy, Chief of Intelligence, British Second Army. Murphy now set out to take charge of Himmler, the prize prisoner. Murphy was at the time rather out of sorts, suffering the effects of a string of victory parties. He got a lift to Kolkhagen in the car of Colonel M.A.C. Osborne, GSO-1, General Staff Officer 1, Military Intelligence Operations, 2nd Army. They arrived at the camp at 9:45 p.m. Rice and Murphy conferred. Then Murphy ordered Himmler to strip for a second time, which he refused to do. Murphy threatened him with being forcibly stripped, and Himmler reluctantly complied. Afterwards, Himmler refused to don British battle dress and wore only a grey German army shirt, his underpants and socks, his original uniform being retained by the British. An army blanket was handed to him in lieu of a coat. Murphy was, according to his later statements, concerned about the missing cyanide ampule. He decided to have a doctor conduct a body cavity search, not at the camp, but at a requisitioned house in Lüneburg, ominously called the House for Special Purposes, located at 31A Ulsenerstrasse. A doctor was to meet them at the house. This again is rather strange. Why didn't Murphy order the camp doctor to simply conduct the body cavity search? Allowing Himmler to go for a nice drive in a car, of course, would give him the opportunity once again to kill himself. At 10:40 p.m., Himmler got into a car, sitting in the back between Murphy's second-in-command and a guard, Murphy in the front passenger seat. Himmler even offered driving directions when Murphy became lost on the way to Lüneburg. It would prove to be Himmler's last journey, as we shall see in the next episode when we examine what exactly occurred at 31A Ulsenerstrasse that resulted in the Reichsführer's death. Arriving at 31A Ulsenerstrasse, Murphy and Himmler were met by Captain Clement Wells of the Royal Army Medical Corps, a 55-year-old officer and in civilian life a general practitioner. He was considerably older than Colonel Murphy, who of course outranked him. The other person to meet them was Company Sergeant Major Edwin Austin of the Headquarters Defense Company. Murphy ordered Wells to examine Himmler for poison, to which the annoyed Dr. Wells replied, "I'm a doctor, not a detective." Murphy, a young, rather arrogant man, snapped back at him, "You will do as you are told." With this strain between the Allied officers involved, the examination now went ahead. Himmler was not the first senior Nazi to have passed through the hands of the staff at 31A Ulsenerstrasse. SS Obergruppenführer Hans Adolf Pulzmann, higher SS and police leader for Russia, North and Ukraine, had been appointed by Himmler to set up the Wehrwolf, stay behind Nazi partisan forces in Germany. Captured on the 21st of May 1945, the 43-year-old Pulzmann had committed suicide inside number 31A. He had apparently swallowed poison, despite being searched thoroughly several times. Colonel Murphy was apparently keen that such an event would never occur again on his watch, or so he later said. Bear in mind that by the time Himmler entered the front parlour of 31A Ulsenerstrasse, Lüneburg, on the 23rd of May 1945, 2 days after General Pulzmann had died in the same room, he had been subjected to 2 thorough strip searches. His mouth had certainly not been searched, but he had been fed both hot tea and British Army doorstep sandwiches at Kolkhagen camp, somehow managing to chew and swallow despite the later contention that he was concealing a glass cyanide capsule in his mouth that measured 35.
Washer's all washed up. I love it.
AC went kaput? That's cool.
With a home warranty from American Home Shield,
Every day is a good day for a breakdown. You don't have to worry about the day when something stops working or expensive repairs. Because when surprise breakdowns happen, AHS will be there to fix or replace parts of the systems and appliances you rely on every day. They help protect your time and money by connecting you with qualified pros and helping pay for covered repairs or replacements. AHS offers affordable plans for every home and options to tailor your coverage so it's just right. With more than 50 years of experience, they know how to keep you smiling when things don't go as planned. It feels good to be right when things go wrong. Get the protection you need with American Home Shield. Sign up today and get 50% off. Visit AHS.com or call 833-PLAN-AHS for this limited time offer.
Qué pelotudo, ¿eh?
By 9mm. This seems very unlikely. The Army's subsequent report on Himmler's death is riddled with inconsistencies due to witness testimonies that conflict to the official line. And frankly, it suggests a sanitized version of the truth was offered to either protect Colonel Murphy's reputation and that of his men who bungled the search, or for some more nefarious reason. The front parlour, unlike the official report and illustrations from the period, was unfurnished and freezing cold, the windows standing wide open. Himmler, according to the report, stripped for the third time. Murphy left the room, probably to use the lavatory, as he was still hungover. The only other person in the room, apart from Dr. Wells, was Company Sergeant Major Austin. In his search for poison, Wells decided to examine Himmler's mouth first and not to examine his rectum, the only other hiding place. Wells examined Himmler all over, lulling him into a false sense of security, then asked him to open his mouth. This Himmler did. Wells then claimed to see the tip of a small object sticking up between the left cheek and teeth. At this point, Himmler bit down hard on the object and Wells' fingers, crushing a glass ampule of cyanide. His face constricted with pain and went bright red, his veins standing out, eyes going glassy, and he collapsed to the floor. Wells shouted, "My God, it's in his mouth! He's done it on me!" The latter doesn't sound, according to one historian, to be the utterances of a well-educated middle-class country doctor. Several other people rushed into the room as Wells tried to mop out Himmler's mouth with a wet handkerchief and also tried to give him artificial respiration. At one point, Himmler was jerked up by the ankles in an attempt to make the poison run out. Himmler breathed heavily for 30 seconds and his pulse continued for another minute longer. Then he died. So ended Heinrich Himmler. The question is, why would Himmler have committed suicide at the point alleged by the official British report on the affair? This was the third physical search he had been given that evening, and he had been treated well, given food and drink, offered fresh clothing, and not abused in any way. It should be remembered that Himmler had voluntarily revealed his identity to the Allies, which seemed strange if he was planning to commit suicide. But several other people rushed into the doesn't sound red. His veins stabbed, Himmler bit down hard and claimed to... Wells examined Himmler all over, lulling him into a false sense of security, then asked him to open his mouth. This Himmler did. Wells then claimed to see the tip of a small object sticking up between the left cheek and teeth. At this point, Himmler bit down hard on the object and Wells' finger claimed this. Wells poisoned. Wells decided to examine Himmler's mouth first and not to examine his rectum, the only other hiding place. Wells examined Himmler all over, lulling him into a false sense of security, then asked him to open his mouth. This Himmler did. Wells then claimed to see the tip of a small object sticking up between the left cheek and teeth. At this point, Himmler bit down hard on the object and Wells' fingers, crushing a glass ampule of cyanide. His face constricted with pain and went bright red, his veins standing out, eyes going glassy, and he collapsed to the floor. Wells shouted, "My God, it's in his mouth! He's done it on me!" The latter doesn't sound, according to one historian, to be the utterances of a well-educated middle-class country doctor. Several other people rushed into the room as Wells tried to mop out Himmler's mouth with a wet handkerchief and also tried to give him artificial respiration. At one point, Himmler was jerked up by the ankles in an attempt to make the poison run out. Himmler breathed heavily for 30 seconds, and his pulse continued for another minute longer. Then he died. So ended Heinrich Himmler. The question is, why would Himmler have committed